So you know how sometimes you hear a news story and it's just like,
Yeah.
what is happening?
Mm.
That happened to me the other day when I saw President Trump is invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798,
Oh, wow.
which, if you think about it for a second, is a law that is older than the current version of the United States Constitution.
Wow.
It's 227 years old.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of incredible that this is happening today.
It's amazing how these pieces of legislation from a completely different era can kind of reemerge in the modern day, and it
Yeah.
really makes you think about the continuities in history and politics.
Yeah, and it's not just some like obscure legal thing. It's like front and center right now
Mm.
because President Trump is invoking this specifically to address Venezuelan migrants who are suspected of being members of the Tren de Aragua gang.
Right.
And this is like a whole can of worms that we're going to get into today because there's a
Yeah.
lot to unpack here.
Absolutely.
So what we're going to do is we're going to take a deep dive into this whole situation.
Okay.
And our source for this is a really in-depth report from CBS News.
Great.
And our goal is to give you, the listener, all the key information you need to understand what is happening here.
Right.
So we're going to talk about, what is the Alien Enemies Act? Why is President Trump using it right now? Who is it targeting? What are the legal challenges that it's facing?
Yeah.
So really think of this as a way to get quickly up to speed on a very complicated situation.
I think it's a great example of how sometimes these seemingly historical or archaic laws can suddenly become incredibly relevant
Yeah.
in contemporary political debates.
Yeah, so let's jump into it.
Okay.
First and foremost, what is the Alien Enemies Act of 1798?
Well, at its core, it's a wartime law.
Okay.
It essentially gives the president the authority to detain and deport citizens of countries that the United States is at war with.
So just to be clear, it's not just citizens. It's like anyone from that country, right?
Right, exactly. Anyone who's a citizen or subject of a hostile nation.
Okay, got it.
And as you mentioned earlier, it dates back to 1798, which is incredible to think about.
Wow.
That's only 22 years after the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, I mean, the country was still figuring things out. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. They were still establishing a lot of the fundamental legal frameworks
Right.
we operate under today.
So, like, what was going on back then that made them think we need this law?
Well, it was a time of a lot of international instability.
Okay.
There was a lot of tension with France in particular, and they were worried about potential conflicts with other European powers.
Got it.
So they wanted a way to deal with people within the U.S. borders who might pose a threat
Right.
because of their allegiance to an enemy nation in a time of war.
Okay, so it's like
It's about...
if we're at war with France and there are French citizens here,
Right.
and they could potentially be, spies or saboteurs or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, it was about maintaining internal security during times of external conflict.
Okay, makes sense.
And it's important to note that this law has actually been used pretty sparingly throughout history.
Great. I was going to ask, like, how many times has this actually been invoked?
Not that many.
Okay.
CBS News points out that it was used during World War I and World War II.
Okay.
And as you might expect, it was used against citizens of countries that the U.S. was actively at war with.
Okay, so like
Germany.
Italy, Japan, that kind of thing?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So it's not like this is some kind of like everyday tool that presidents use.
Right.
It's been reserved for very specific circumstances.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the current situation so unusual.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting. Because now President Trump is invoking this law against Venezuelan migrants.
Right.
And the U.S. is not at war with Venezuela.
Right.
And it's not even that he's saying, like, all Venezuelans are the enemy. It's that he's saying members of this specific gang,
Tren de Aragua.
Tren de Aragua, are the enemy. And that justifies using this wartime law.
Yeah, and that's a really significant departure from how this law has been used in the past.
Yeah, it's a huge leap, it feels like.
Absolutely. It raises a lot of questions about whether this is an appropriate use of this kind of power.
So let's talk about the justification. Like, what is President Trump saying?
Okay, so according to his proclamation, as reported by CBS News,
Okay.
President Trump claims that Tren de Aragua is, quote, perpetrating, attempting, and threatening an invasion or predatory incursion against the territory of the United States, unquote.
Invasion.
Yeah.
That's strong language.
It is, and it seems to be the key to his argument that this situation is serious enough to warrant using this wartime authority.
Even though there's no declared war.
Exactly.
Okay, so he's saying this gang is basically invading the U.S.
That's the claim.
And based on that, he's issued a directive to the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice.
Right.
And that directive says they need to apprehend, restrain, secure, and remove every Venezuelan migrant 14 years of age or older who is suspected of being a member or associate of Tren de Aragua and who lacks U.S. citizenship or lawful permanent resident status.
Okay, so they're really going after anyone they even suspect might be connected to this gang.
Yeah, and that's part of what's so controversial about this, because how do you prove someone is a member of a gang?
Right. There are a lot of due process concerns there.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to get into that in a minute.
Okay.
But first I want to understand, like, is the argument here that this gang is basically like a terrorist organization?
Well, it's interesting because President Trump also claims that Tren de Aragua has a close alignment with the Venezuelan government under President Nicolas Maduro.
Okay.
So it seems like he's trying to connect the gang's actions to the Venezuelan government.
To a hostile foreign power.
Right.
Okay.
And the CBS News report says that he alleges that the gang's objectives include harming U.S. citizens, undermining public safety, and destabilizing democratic nations in the Americas.
Including the U.S.
Including the U.S.
Right.
So it seems like the argument is that this gang is not just some random criminal organization, but that they're actually working on behalf of a foreign government.
And that makes them a national security threat.
Right, and therefore subject to this wartime law.
Okay, so that's the justification. But now let's talk about what this means for the people who are actually being targeted by this.
Yeah, this is where things get really concerning.
So what happens to someone if they're apprehended under this act?
Well, according to the CBS News report, they would be subject to summary arrest, detention, and deportation.
Summary arrest.
Yeah, which means they can be apprehended and removed from the country much faster than through normal immigration proceedings.
So they don't get to see a judge? They don't get to make their case?
It's very likely that they would not have those same opportunities.
Okay.
They wouldn't necessarily have the chance to apply for asylum.
Wow, so basically they're treated as enemy combatants.
Essentially.
Yeah.
That's pretty heavy.
It is, and it's not surprising that this has sparked a lot of outrage. Yeah, the ACLU immediately filed a lawsuit challenging this.
Right.
And a federal judge in Washington, D.C. issued a temporary restraining order blocking the deportations.
Yes. Chief Judge James Boasberg issued a temporary restraining order for 14 days.
Okay, so that means for now, no one can be deported under this act.
That's right.
And there were even reports of deportation flights being ordered to turn around midair.
Yeah, the judge basically said any flights carrying people who might be subject to this order need to come back to the U.S.
Wow, so this is like active intervention by the courts.
Absolutely. It's a pretty dramatic response.
And the ACLU was very happy about this.
Yeah, League Alert, the ACLU attorney who's leading the legal challenge, called President Trump's use of this act flat out lawless.
Lawless. Strong words.
And he expressed relief that the judge recognized the severe harm that these people would face if they were deported.
Okay, so the ACLU is basically saying this is illegal and it's going to hurt people.
That's their argument, yeah.
But the government obviously disagrees.
Right. Attorney General Pam Bondi issued a statement condemning the judge's ruling.
Okay, what did she say?
She said that the judge is essentially supporting Tren de Aragua terrorists over the safety of Americans.
Terrorists?
Yeah. So you can see how charged the rhetoric is getting here.
Wow.
She also said that the order disregards the president's authority and puts the public and law enforcement at risk.
So they're really digging in on this.
Yeah, they're not backing down.
Okay. So we've got this legal battle brewing.
Right.
And the courts are going to have to decide some pretty fundamental questions about, how far does the president's power extend? What does the Alien Enemies Act actually mean in the 21st century?
Right.
And what rights do these migrants have, even if they're accused of being gang members?
Yeah, and it's not just about this specific case. It could set a precedent for how future presidents use this law.
Which, as you said, is very old and was designed for a very different time.
Exactly.
Okay, so to sum this all up, we have President Trump invoking a 227-year-old law designed for wartime against a nation state.
Right.
And he's using it against a non-state actor, a gang.
Tren de Aragua.
Right.
And migrants who are from a country that the U.S. is not actively at war with.
Right.
That's the key point here.
Yeah, so it's a very unusual situation, to say the least.
It's precedented.
And it's going to be fascinating to see how this all plays out.
Absolutely.
But this whole situation raises a really interesting question for you, the listener. In a world where we're facing threats from all kinds of new sources.
Right.
Not just countries, but terrorist groups and criminal gangs and cyber attacks and all sorts of things.
Yeah, the lines are getting blurred.
Exactly. Does that mean we need to rethink how we use these old laws, like the Alien Enemies Act?
It's a good question.
Are they still relevant? Are they effective? Or are they just too dangerous to use in the 21st century?
And if we do start using these old laws in new ways, what does that mean for individual rights?
Yeah. What happens to due process when the government can just declare someone an enemy and deport them without a trial?
It's a tough balancing act
It is.
between national security and individual liberty.
Right. And that's something we all need to be thinking about.
I agree.
So there you have it, folks. That's the situation with the Alien Enemies Act and Venezuelan migrants.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.